Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're going to start things off today with a quick trip back to the Hunter's Dream, and then we're going to have a few words with the doll.
Welcome home, good hunter. What is it you desire?
Well, really, I was just curious if you had anything new that you wanted to say to me.
Over time, countless hunters have visited this dream. The graves here stand in their memory. It all seems so long ago now.
Good to know, and now I'm going to level up.
Very well.
While I'm doing that, though, let's take another look at that brief set of lines we just got. More literally, the translation would be something like, "In the past, many good hunters have visited this nightmare. The graves here are all their memorials." Although, I believe this was all very long ago now. And while this is a short set of dialogue with a pretty straightforward translation, there are a few interesting points here that I really wanted to spend some time on. For one thing, we have a little bit more information to bring to bear on a theory that I raised all the way back in episode 4. It was a point that I made in relation to the translation of the Old Hunter Bell. So let's go back now and take another look at the relevant line. As usual, I will read out my own translation while putting the official one on the screen. "The old hunters who've lost the dream but cannot forget the hunt and trust their thoughts to the messengers." And the shift that I really wanted to focus on was the change from hunters who've lost the dream to hunters who have long passed from the dream. At the time, I argued that the use of the word past probably had something to do with the connotations that that word has with death. Of course, there could still be more going on here, but one reason I think that this reading is pretty likely is that the doll is telling us that the graves stand here in the memory of hunters past. On some level then, I do think the game wants us to be conscious of their dying. But there's more to focus on in this short set of lines than just information to help back up previous translation theories. For instance, there's the way that the doll notably refers to us as good hunter. This is actually something that I've carried over in my own translation when I gave the more literal version of the doll's line just now. I have it as, "In the past, many good hunters have visited this nightmare." And the reason the doll is greeting us with this particular phrase is because in the original Japanese, she's using an honorific form of address. The term in question here is Karyudo-sama, and the key part of that phrase is the last part, sama. Referring to someone with this particular honorific in Japanese is somewhat similar to saying my lord or my lady in English. Thus, a fairly literal translation in this case would be Lord Hunter, Hunter being Karyudo. But there are a few issues with that arguably more literal version of that translation. First of all, there's the issue of the prevalence of the terms. To be referred to as a lord or a lady in modern English is pretty jarring. Yet in modern Japanese, sama is used fairly commonly. One example that springs to mind is the use of the word okyakusama, which is a fairly common way of referring to customers in Japanese. Yet that sama in okyakusama is the same one that we're discussing here. On a somewhat related note, there's also the issue of the time period that the term in question invokes. Sama is fairly neutral, while Lord, I think, gets at the idea of the Middle Ages, something that doesn't really fit Bloodborne. And then, of course, there's the issue of gender. The player character can be either male or female, and while the game does have alternate dialogue options for whether you're playing a male or female character, it's easier if you can find a unisex term. So with all of that in mind, I think good hunter or honorable hunter is a great way to get across the required information while avoiding some of the pitfalls of a more direct lord or lady hunter. To bring this back to the doll's dialogue, though, I do think it's interesting that for the countless hunters that visited the dream in the past, the official translation, unlike the Japanese, doesn't use good hunter or some other equivalent term. This has the effect of seeming to raise the doll's respect for us as the current hunter. Of course, this is a fairly subtle point. Moving on though, another small point I think is interesting here about the doll's dialogue is her use of the term nightmare. At least, that's the term that she would be using if this was a more literal translation. The Japanese characters, which you can see on the screen, literally mean bad and then dream. Notably, however, in the official translation, the doll uses the word dream. And I think that the reason they went with this was to be clear about the location the doll is referring to. This area is called the Hunter's Dream after all, and in the full context of the line, the doll is saying, over time, countless hunters have visited this dream. You can see how it might be odd that the doll would refer to the Hunter's Dream as a nightmare. In general, this seems like a reasonable change to me, but as you'll see, in the context of Bloodborne, I think it's an interesting one. We'll have more to say about nightmares as we continue to make our way through the game, though. For now, add that to the list of things to keep in mind as we move forward. And that leaves just one more thing I wanted to talk about regarding the doll's dialogue. In my more literal version of the translation, the second sentence is, "The graves here are all their memorials." And while that's not an inaccurate translation, the Japanese term being used here, nagori, has a slightly broader meaning. It can be used to refer to the lingering after effects of something, the feeling of sorrow that you get at parting, the remains of something, or even the end of something. And that's all in addition to its use as a memorial for something. And I bring this up because while a certain amount of nuance is lost no matter what, I feel like the official version of "the graves here stand in their memory" does a great job of expressing that broader sentiment. And now, having said all that, let's get back to Alfred.
Oh, good to see you safe. Now, let's think up something to discuss. Just tell me what piques your interest.
Okay, what's this Byrgenwerth place?
Byrgenwerth is an old place of learning, and the Tomb of the Gods, carved out below Yharnam, should be familiar to every hunter. Well, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. In this sense, everything sacred in Yharnam can be traced back to Byrgenwerth. But today, the college lies deep within a tangled wood, abandoned and decrepit. And furthermore, the Healing Church has declared Byrgenwerth forbidden ground. It's unclear how many of its scholars remain alive, but only they know the password that allows passage through the gate.
Alright, thanks. Now I'm out of here.
I bid you farewell. It has been a pleasure. May the good blood guide your way.
So that was a lot of information, but fortunately much of the translation is pretty straightforward. Here's a comparison so you can see for yourself. Byrgenwerth is an old learning place. If you're a hunter, then I'm sure you know of the Graveyard of the Gods, which spreads out deep underground beneath Yharnam. Once, a few of those who learned at Byrgenwerth returned to the surface from that graveyard with a certain holy body, and the Healing Church, as well as the salvation of blood, were born. In other words, Byrgenwerth is the place where what made Yharnam into sacred ground began. But now it is abandoned, and I hear it is buried within a deep wood. On top of that, Byrgenwerth has been designated forbidden ground by the Healing Church. Who knows how many of its students remain alive, but the gate guard likely won't open the gate without the password that only they know. So again, I think for the most part, this translation is fairly straightforward. Still, there are some key differences here, and those are what I'd like to focus on. Arguably, the biggest changes involve the discovery of the holy medium. More literally, we're talking about the bringing back of the holy body. In Japanese, the verb that's being used is mochikaeru, and this is something of a compound verb. The first part, motsu, means to hold, and the second part, kaeru, means to return. So if you literally put these two together with mochikaeru, you get to hold on to something and return. Combine this with a literal version of the word seitai, or holy body, and you get a pretty strong picture of what's going on here. The literal Japanese, at least for me, implies that these scholars found an actual body, which they considered to be holy, in this underground labyrinth, and then they brought it back to the surface with them. Contrast that with the official translation of, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This translation, I think, is a little bit more vague in general, and it also obscures the fact that the scholars brought back what they found. Although, on the other hand, the use of the word discover does go pretty well with the idea of scholars conducting experiments and making investigations. Also, since Alfred's next line tells us that this led to the founding of the Healing Church, you know they didn't just leave what they found there to rot. So arguably, the official translation does get this idea across simply by implication rather than by outright statement. The alternative, keeping character counts in mind, would have to be something along the lines of, well, once a team of Byrgenwerth scholars brought back a holy medium from deep within the tomb. Finally, it's also worth considering that at this point in the game, this information is supposed to be cryptic. Arguably, being obscure here is part of the point. I personally feel like a little bit more clarity wouldn't have hurt things, but that's something that you'll have to decide for yourself. That's enough on dialogue, though. Let's get back to an item description. Charred hunter garb, one of the staple articles of hunter attire, fashioned at the workshop. A product of the scourge of the beast that once plagued Old Yharnam and culminated in the town's fiery cleansing. The cape's dampness makes it highly resistant to fire. Wearers of this attire hunted down victims of the scourge who survived the raging flames and stench of singed blood. And then the second section of the other items in the set have a slightly different description. A product of the scourge of the beast that once plagued Old Yharnam and culminated in the town's fiery cleansing, designed to be highly resistant to fire. And the translation on this set I think is fairly strong. Here's a comparison with a more literal translation. One of the standard hunter outfits prepared by the workshop, made in the time of the Old Yharnam incident, when the plague of beasts was horribly rampant and the town was burned in purification. The cape, which seems to be soaked through, exhibits a high defensive effect from flames. This is the sort of attire that was used amidst the raging flames and scent of burning blood to hunt surviving victims of the plague. And for the most part, I think you can see what I mean when I call this a strong translation. The first line in particular I think makes for a good example of this. Rather than one of the standard hunter outfits, you have one of the staple articles of hunter attire. The same general information is being conveyed, but in a much more stylish and appropriate way. And that goes for most of the rest of this translation as well. There's really only one point that stands out to me as an exception. It comes in the final line and it has to do with setting. And since this is a little bit of a tricky point and I wanted to try out something new, I thought I would include the original Japanese on the screen. The way that I read this sentence, the part of it that refers to the raging flames and stench of singed blood, is separate from the part of the sentence that describes the victims of the scourge who survived. This is why my more literal translation is, this is the sort of attire that was used amidst the raging flames and scent of burning blood to hunt surviving victims of the plague. In other words, the flames and the scent of blood are part of the setting. The official translation, once again, is, wearers of this attire hunted down victims of the scourge who survived the raging flames and stench of singed blood. This makes it sound as if the flames and the scent of blood are something else that the beasts survived. The effect of this, at least for me, is that when I read the English version, I imagine merciless hunters cutting down beasts as they run from the flames, whereas when I read the Japanese version, I still think of merciless hunters cutting down beasts, but in a setting that's chaotic and unpleasant for everyone involved. But anyway, now that we're standing outside the boss area, there's a certain set of items I'd like to equip. And the first of them, you'll note, is a pungent blood cocktail. And I wanted to do that specifically because of something that I experienced when I was first playing this game. I was having a hard time fighting this boss, and so I went online to look up some strategies to help me fight it. At the time, one of the most common pieces of advice I ran across emphasized that the text of the pungent blood cocktail gives you a clue that you should use it to fight this boss. So let me read the English text of that item description again. Mature blood cocktail that releases a pungent odor when thrown that attracts bloodthirsty beasts. A precious tool in sadly short supply. In Yharnam, they produce more blood than alcohol, as the former is the more intoxicating. And the relevant line there is, attracts bloodthirsty beasts, because this boss's name is the blood-starved beast. I was curious whether this hint was in the Japanese as well, and it turns out that not only is it there, but it also has an interesting twist. In English, the item says that it attracts bloodthirsty beasts, and this boss is the blood-starved beast. In Japanese, it's actually just the opposite. The item says it attracts blood-starved beasts, and the title of this boss is the Bloodthirsty Beast. I like everything about this. Calling the boss Blood-Starved helps its name to stand out in English, where bloodthirsty is a fairly common adjective, and it preserves the clue in the item description while not having exactly the same name as the boss. Really, I think this is a good example of how simple translation choices can be used to great effect. But there was one other thing I wanted to talk about in this boss fight, and that is the effect of beasthood. And though I wish I could have given a better demonstration, this is how it works. Taking a beast blood pellet gives you access to this meter, which you can now see on the screen. If, like me, you fail to attack enough, the meter goes down until it goes away, but you can still fill it as long as the beast blood pellet's effect is active. The more that meter fills up, the more bonus you'll get to your attacks, and also the more penalties you'll suffer to your defense. And the reason I wanted to bring up how this works is because, like with Insight and Frenzy, there's a story behind this particular stat. In fact, all three of those stats, Beasthood, Frenzy, and Insight, are related to one another. Of course, I've already talked about how having high levels of Insight makes you more susceptible to taking Frenzy damage, but another effect of high Insight is that it lowers your Beasthood gauge. And again, I think this is something that works in both languages. Having a great deal of Enlightenment-style rational knowledge would keep you from being as in touch with your own bestial nature. Similarly, having a great deal of insight into the true nature of the world would prevent you from losing yourself to your inner beasthood. Also, as far as beasthood itself is concerned, consider the incentive to keep on the attack. Entering this beast mode encourages an aggressive style of play, especially with the rally system that allows you to regain health even if you take hits that are harder because of your lowered defense. Really, I think Beasthood is a very apt name for this stat. And don't forget that wonderfully evocative part of the Beast Blood Pellet description. Ripping apart the flesh of one's enemies and being rained upon by their splattering blood invigorates one's sense of beasthood, feeding strength and euphoric feeling alike. I've talked before about how Bloodborne has a tendency to use game-specific terminology in more of an everyday sense. This is something that makes translation particularly difficult. Just look at how much context goes into deciding on the use of a specific term for something like insight. But despite that challenge, I really feel like this ends up being something of a strength for Bloodborne and other games like it. Personally, I love it when stats and the way they interact can help further the themes and story of a game. And on that note, we've now reached the end of yet another episode. As always, I'd just like to say if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, I would love to hear them. Thanks for watching, everyone.